Before we begin, I want to show you how I organize my layers, to make it easier to understand how we will change things later. You can speed up this part or skip to the next timestamp if you wish. To check my values, I keep a black layer with the blending mode set to color on top of my artwork, which I can toggle on and off. As you can see, I can see my artwork's values whenever I want. Now the second layer is my signature. It's not really relevant for this tutorial, but remember to always sign your artwork so people know who made it. If you remember from the previous tutorial, I have my foreground blurred to add depth of field, and the background blurred for the same reason. If I hide these layers, everything is in focus. This is a details layer, where I made my brush quite small and added texture and ambient occlusion here and there. If I remove this, you can see that the scene beneath is a bit rougher than before. Then we have the characters folder. There are a bunch of layers in it, basically the base colors and some other layers on top for the sunlight effect. Then we have a couple of layers for the overall sunlight effect. This is made using a flattened copy of the whole image with the higher values and warmer colors. And then beneath we have the layer mask. Underneath we have the skylight layers. If you remember, in the last video I mentioned that in daylight scenes the sky acts as a secondary light source, projecting a blue light all over the place. Here as well we have the main bluish layer and the layer mask. In the middle ground we have the rocks on a separate layer because I have adjusted their values separately. And right underneath I have the flattened image that has both basic colors and values combined. Below that, we have our basic color layer that was painted on top of our values. And this is done with the blending mode set to color in order to preserve our values underneath. Then we have our base values. And here is where we upscaled and painted over the initial sketch to make it fill the canvas. And finally, we are back to our original thumbnail. Now let's take our project and duplicate it so we don't mess with the original. Give it a logical name. We'll call this sunset as this is the time of the day we're aiming for. Now first thing we need to do is bring our scene back to the ambient light stage, before any main lighting was added, such as the sunlight, the skylight, or any other details. So I'll go to the skylight layers and hide these and any other layers above, leaving the base we need for our new scene. Okay, so this is a good base, so I'll delete all these layers because we already have them in another project and we don't need them in this one. Having lots of layers may make your file quite messy, plus unnecessary layers eat up a lot of RAM on your iPad or on your computer, so try to avoid keeping them around. Now we're back at square one with our previously chosen color palette and basic ambient light. Before proceeding, you remember that in the last tutorial we analyzed how light behaves and how it influences a scene. In the previous scene, we explored the most common light source, the sun. As we know from our basic color theory, white is the blending of all the colors combined, while black is the absence of colors. So naturally, our sunlight is perceived by us as a white light, and enables us to see all the colors in the light spectrum. What happens though if we slightly change our light color? And how does that influence our perception? Here you can see I'm playing with an RGB light, and the whole scene changes accordingly with it. As we can observe, the colors present in my scene change dramatically, but why is that? Well, if my light source is green, for example, the green hue is going to add to all the other colors. This doesn't just shift everything towards green, but also limits our colors within a range. For example, in this case, because of the influence of green light, I will never be able to reach a fully saturated red. Looking at the spectrum, we limited our color in a range close to our green hues. If you remember this example in my previous video on how to get better at drawing characters, in this painting, my green leaves are shifted towards an orange because my main light is red, and that influences the color of the whole scene, so it won't be possible to have a fully saturated green under the influence of such light. Now, little break. Sorry to bother you, but I just wanted to ask you to please smash the like button if you find this useful, because it helps a lot with the YouTube algorithm and it allows me to do more of this. Now let's go back to our scene. Now, why did I talk about colored light? What does it have to do with my scene? Even if we don't see it, the air particles in the atmosphere scatter the light rays, pretty much in the same way it happens to a prism. Basically, when the sun is more perpendicular to us, the light rays only have to pass through a limited amount of atmosphere to reach us. Now, when that happens, the effect of the scattering doesn't affect our light perception too much. At sunrise or sunset, however, the light rays hit the Earth's surface at a different angle, and they have to go through a much bigger layer of atmosphere. When this happens, the colder waves of the color spectrum disperse quite quickly, leaving mostly red and yellow light to reach us. Basically, our white sunlight becomes red light. And as we have seen before, it's going to heavily influence the colors of our scene and definitely limit our color choices. So how do we shift our colors to make them appear under the influence of a sunset? First of all, let's go back to my scene that is now a basic ambient light scene. Let's copy the whole scene in a new layer, go to Adjustments and select Color Balance. Now we can shift our colors slightly towards red and magenta. Now this scene is definitely not painted in a realistic style, and although we set our feet in some realistic ground, we can give ourselves a bit of artistic license, and I want to shift the colors more towards magenta than a more realistic red hue. Now this changed our colors slightly, but it's not quite enough, it's just a base. We need to apply the same filter to our image that is applied to our light, so my choice would be to make a new layer, then fill it with a nice magenta, set the blending mode to color. And now all of our scene is magenta, which is not quite what we want. We want to keep some color variation, we just want to add some bit of magenta to those colors. So we just need to turn down the opacity quite a bit until we are satisfied. Okay, cool, now we have the perfect base. At sunset, the sun is going down, but it's still there, so we kinda need to bring it back. Same as we did with the old scene, we are going to copy the whole scene into a new layer. Then we are going to edit the curves and raise its values. But not as much as we did last time. At sunset, the light is lower intensity because the light rays are not perpendicular. Let's also edit the color balance and move it a little bit towards yellow, so we can have some contrast with the magenta that is technically a slightly cooler color. Let's call this layer Sunlight. Then let's add a new empty layer underneath and make the sunlight layer a mask of the empty one. Now we can paint the sun in. The sunlight is going to be at a different angle from our previous scene, because it's much lower in the sky. So let's say that instead of this direction, the rays comes from here, at this angle. Remember that coming from here, a lot of objects are going to cast a long shadow, like the side of the hut roof. Okay, sunlight done. Now it's time to think about what our characters are doing. At midday, they were just chilling on the grass. But now it's around dinner time, so their activities are probably shifting indoors. Maybe they have a fire going and they need to keep it alive for the night. So let's make our young boy chop some wood for that fire. Let's say he's coming back with the chopped wood while the cat is sleeping on the roof. After the quick sketch and the base colors, there's some super quick shading. But I also need to adjust the values to distinguish the boy from the background, otherwise it gets lost. Same old trick for the sunlight. I'll just paste him on another layer, raise the values and shift the colors and make a mask. Then paint in the sunlight again. Now this time there is actually a fire inside the hut, so I can keep the smoke coming out of the chimney. The scene is starting to come together quite nicely now, but the environment is still quite rough, so we need to add some more elements. Remember the ambient light generated from the sky in the last scene? Well, it happens at sunset as well, but it's much less blue and slightly less saturated. So this time I'm painting it on top because it's actually faster. How am I going to do that? Let's say we want to paint it on the roof, for example. I'm going to pick a sample of the roof color and then shift it slightly towards a cooler purple. And we need to lower the saturation a little bit as well. Let's make another layer and paint it on top of all the surfaces that are exposed to the sky, or the open environment. Together with this, I'm also taking the opportunity to add some extra texture and ambient occlusion to the roof. Remember what ambient occlusion is? It's a deep shadow area in tight places where light can't reach. So then I can paint the skylight all over the place, cooling those warm tones slightly and lowering the saturation, painting the new tint onto each surface. Try to keep it subtle. If it becomes too loud, it risks becoming another primary source of light, and this will unbalance your values a lot. Now I'm going to go through the whole middle ground and paint in details, textures and ambient occlusions with a small brush. And finally it's time to paint the bounce light. As I explained in the first part of this tutorial, light that hits a surface bounces off, scattering around and hitting other surfaces. Now I want to stop for a moment and explain how to paint bounce light. Bounce light comes from a specific direction. and therefore it pretty much always generates a gradient. There are two different ways to paint this gradient, and I don't particularly prefer one or another. I just use either depending on the situation. The first one consists in taking my base object color and then painting the other color on top. This is not quite blended, isn't it? But Procreate, as well as many other painting softwares like Photoshop, Krita or Clip Studio Paint, have a smudge tool or blending tool. This tool allows me to blend the two colors together by just painting on top. I can choose the type of brush, intensity of the brush, and size. The other technique is done more manually. I just paint the base, then the color on top, keeping the pressure sensitivity of my brush. In Procreate this is always the case, but in Photoshop, for example, you can toggle it on and off. I'm going to pick the color in between them and paint on top. Then add another more subtle tone between the two, and so on, until I'm happy with my gradient. Back to the scene, let's see how painting the ambient light effect improved the image. Now we're almost done. But same as the last one, we need to add some depth of field to give some atmospheric effect to our scene. So let's copy the scene, go to Adjustment and Gaussian Blur, and blur until we like it. Remove everything but the foreground, and repeat this for the background, so that only the middle of the image remains in focus. So this is it. This is how we paint a scene from scratch, and then we change its mood, passing from midday to sunset. I hope this was useful, and if it was, share the video and subscribe for more. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Ciao!
I know why.
La 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 la.